All right, guys, welcome to another episode here. I'm with Courtenay Turner. I don't know if you want to give a little bit of a intro, a little bit of a bio for yourself right at the start here.
Sure. CourtenayTurner.com, best place where you can find me. It's I spell my name like Courtenay, COURTENAYTURNER.com. It is pronounced Courtney, but it's spelled like Courtenay, so I tell people that so they know how to find me. And I think including some of the other shows I've been on, and my live streams were at something like 750 episodes in the past 4 years. So I've been very busy. I'm the host of the Courtenay Turner podcast, and that's probably the best place they can find all the information on me. And we were just talking about Austin and Santa Monica. And so I fled Santa Monica, and that was actually really how I got into podcasting, because I'm hearing impaired and everybody was all masked up. And I learned how to speak by reading lips. I didn't get hearing aids until I was almost 6 years old. And I didn't realize how much I still depended on all the nonverbal cues and lip reading for clarity of speech, until all the coping mechanisms I spent my entire life developing were then just stripped from me by some really tyrannical mandate. So,
right. Masking doesn't help with that.
Not at all. No. So I had really started the podcast as a way to have naked face conversations. That's kind of the Cliff Notes version. And here we are, almost 750. I think we're over 750. I don't think I've uploaded all of them, but yeah. So it's later. So yeah.
Wow. That's awesome. So today I want to talk about, in the brief time that we have, I want to talk about this woke right phenomenon, particularly how right-wing, I don't know if you want to say activists, pundits, political personalities are essentially adopting a left-wing kind of Marxist framework in order to put their right-wing agenda. And just kind of dive into that. I saw you wrote, you sent me those articles, a couple pieces about Christopher Rufo for being one example, promoting this adoption of the Frankfurt School and Gramscian Marxism, and even Alinsky's 12 Rules for Radicals and all of that thing, in order to push the right wing agenda and kind of stomp out the left with this other weird dialectic, if you want to call it that. So just, I guess, dive into that. I guess explain to people as best you can here, like what that is for kind of newcomers that don't really understand what's going on, the normies out here, which was me not so long ago.
Yeah. Well, okay. I will just back up and start by saying, I think what's really important about what's going on here is not the labels, it's the tactics. I think people get very caught up in labels, in personalities. It becomes kind of cult of personalities, cliques, both, online cliques as well as like group cliques. Right. I guess double entendre there. But, that's a lot of what I'm seeing. And I don't find that super productive. I wrote these articles, and actually I was kind of criticized for, either not being harsh enough on certain personalities, or being, too harsh, or not getting enough into the weeds of the people involved, and, those specific kinds of examples. And I'll just say that for me, that's not very interesting. That's like personal, kind of petty. And I'm not saying that, that doesn't have ramifications or larger scope impact. It does, unfortunately. But I'm not interested in that. What I'm interested in is tactics. And I think, there's a reason why our founders crafted this, I believe, a beautiful document, particularly the Bill of Rights, but, the Constitution. And it really was, especially the Bill of Rights, was supposed to be a protectorate. It was supposed to protect the people and limit the government's powers. So it's not about giving all sorts of prescriptives. Right. And I think that when we recognize tactics, we start to recognize, various architecture of empire and of social engineering and of ways of subverting the Constitution. And that is first and foremost what I am interested in. And that is really why I wrote these articles. It was to try and give context. A lot of people don't have the philosophical background. They may hear Antonio Gramsci and they say, who's that? Why do we care? What difference does it make? That's an idol for Christopher Rufo.
I've definitely had that experience conversing with people about this, because I've always been interested in politics. I've always been interested in particularly theology. I almost went to Bible school back in the day. My family's very, my dad's a PhD seminary guy. So is my uncle. I have another uncle that's a pastor. And so I've kind of always grown an interest in politics and theology and kind of the intersection there and things like that. And so, years ago, especially when I saw all this BLM stuff going on, I really wanted to dig in and get to the bottom of kind of what you're saying. Like, what are the ideas behind these weird tactics? And people are embracing all this stuff that I didn't think Americans would just embrace, especially this quickly. Right. And I landed on the Frankfurt School. I landed on Antonio Gramsci. I landed on the Communist Manifesto and Frederick Engels and all this stuff. But a lot of people, they don't know what any of that is, or maybe they hear the names and they recognize the names, but they don't really understand the ideas. And then when they see the tactics implemented, they don't really know what they're looking at.
Yes.
So I guess kind of speak on that, like how would a normal person that doesn't necessarily understand all the philosophical lingo be able to recognize this stuff and point it out for what it is, and maybe even explain it to others? And I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Yeah. So, I'm not one of those people who thought woke right was like the best term.
Yeah. Me too. But it stuck. So yeah.
It stuck. Well, there was a lot of effort to make it stick. But I think, the reason for me that I didn't find it most useful is because there's a much broader scope. And, the broader scope that I see are the subversives. And a lot of this, I think, was actually beta tested and seeded through what I call the indie sphere. And this is it's a holdover from my film days. I was in the film and entertainment industry. And just really quickly to give you, a context, but essentially it's very different today because we have all the streaming modalities. Films are made completely differently than they were even 10 years ago. But, 10, 15 years ago, when you had people who were making films, you kind of had these two classes. You had the studios, this is like MGM and Warner Brothers. They make $300 million, huge blockbuster films, and they spend a fortune. Oftentimes they do it knowing they're going to lose money on it, get a tax write-off, it's a whole formula. Right. But then you have these really independent, like, somebody who is maybe still in school, film school, or just graduated. They get a couple of friends together and they're in their parents' basement. They score some equipment. Maybe they rent some from their school, and they make a creative project. Those are truly independent. And then you had something called indie. It was the indie films. And these might be $1 million, $5 million, $20 million. SAG low budget could be $1 million. That's not, I don't know about you, but I don't know too many people who could just pull out $1 million out of their back pocket.
I wish I could. Hey, Shiloh Hendrix can now. So there you go.
Yeah. After watching her, I'm like, I'm in the wrong business. What am I doing?
I just recorded another podcast with Carrie Smith, and we said that right in the beginning. We're like, this is all it takes to make $1 million. What have we been doing our whole lives? Like, what have we been doing?
I told my husband, I'm like, we need to shift gears here. Like, what on earth are we doing? Working 18 hours a day? That's crazy.
Right.
Barely making ends meet, Yeah. So, I mean, most people don't have that kind of money that they could just throw into a creative, artistic piece. And of course, there's always outliers. There's your trust fund kids. It's always exception, but it's not the norm. But typically these indie people, they're angel investors, and it ends up being, whether it's overt or not, and whether the people involved know it or not, it's usually there's a message they want to convey, right? So it ends up becoming propaganda. And I don't mean that to have a super negative connotation. It's just the reality. Somebody doesn't invest $1 million, $20 million, unless they, and it might be really genuine, heartfelt passion, for this message, but there's a message they want to get across. Yep. So this is the indie sphere. And I see this happening now in the media. We have indie media. Yep. And I don't think they're all that organic. I think there's a lot of money behind them. I think there may even be, and I can't prove this, so this is speculation, but based on, again, the tactics and the results, there could be intelligence money behind it, right?
That's such a good analogy. Sorry to cut you off. That's such a good way to frame it. I've never heard someone frame it that way in relation to the film industry, with indie versus independent versus the studio productions.
Yeah.
But I think that's exactly what's going on. And because I don't think this stuff is organic, I think there's something, especially what makes me believe it's not organic is how quickly everybody, all these big name, they're alternative independent media, but it's still like a Candace Owens or even a Tucker Carlson now, who once was corporate media, but now he's doing his own thing, allegedly, quote unquote. They're pushing this narrative. All this, it's like they just flipped overnight, and they're all drumming the same thing. It's strange. I've been trying to figure out what to make of that.
Pro to Operation Mockingbird, maybe.
Yeah, right.
That's what it looks like.
I would say so. Yeah. Yeah,
it's what it looks like to me. I mean, I don't have the receipts, so I'm not going to make the bold claim, not with certitude, but that's what it looks like is going on, and that's much easier to do, right? When you look back, I think you're quite a bit younger than me, so you probably don't remember, but I'm sure you've heard of when there were maybe 4 news stations, it's like ABC, right. NBC, right?
Yes.
So, back then it cost a lot of money to do that Operation Mockingbird, right? You're talking about big funding engines behind these machines. But now, I mean, to fund an influencer, a team of podcasters, or maybe a very small kind of conglomerate. This is not big bucks for that kind of an operation.
Not big bucks, and you can spend less money and get way more reach with that money.
That's right.
Social media,
and it's also much harder to identify, right?
Exactly.
Because it
feels local. It feels like it's not coming from some big conglomerate, but it probably is. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's all that to say. So when I saw what was going on, because of the nature of what I do and who I have, conversed with, and some of the circles I've run in, I've seen these narratives been percolating for quite a while, much longer than, it went in, much longer than this more new kind of right-wing kind of phenomenon. And most of the people that I've been seeing parroting a lot of these similar narratives actually come from the left. They claim to be outside of, the two-party system. They're, they don't buy into left-right illusions, and they're outside of that entirely. But most of them actually, ideologically are from the left. Mm-hmm. And they may truly believe both sides are corrupt and they're outside of it now, but ideologically that's where their roots are. So it's very interesting just to note that, like, that's where they come from. That's what their foundation was. And now, and all of them are parroting these very, very similar types of narratives. Now, obviously, not all the narratives are the same, because narratives serve purpose for social engineering, for steering, right? So it's not always the same. But I'm just a pattern recognizer, so I start to see. I'm like, wait, I've seen this here. I've seen this here. I think something similar is going on.
Yeah. I have a question for you. So when did you start to notice these kind of Marxist tactics being used on the right? Like when did that hit for you? Or what did you notice that was kind of like this is the same thing over again that we just, because for me, that's kind of what happened. It was like, I studied this stuff on the left, from 2020, 2021, 2022 into 2023. I was trying to pick up a lot of books, read about this stuff, figure out what these ideas are. And then I just started noticing the same kind of what you're saying. I couldn't put a finger on necessarily the goal of it, but I noticed the same patterns, the same strategies that were being used and implemented. And now we're here, of course, and I think it's very obvious that's what's going on. But what was it for you that really kind of set that off?
So I will tell you, when I started my podcast, I used to say that I was very politically oriented. And I would say that, I felt like we could just get the right people into office. We could fix this whole mess. Yeah. And I was so frustrated.
LOL to that, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit. But I feel I was a bit naive in my
me too. Yeah.
views back then. But I kept saying, it's so strange, because I feel like the Republicans are behaving like controlled opposition for the left. A few months in, and it really was just maybe it was even shorter than that, I said, no, the Republican Party was created to be controlled opposition for the left. And so this is what I will say to answer your question in maybe a little bit more tangible terms, is that I think this has been going on for a very long time, this use of Marxist tactics targeting the right. However, what is changing right now is they're being overt about it. They're embracing it. So you have people, the reason I did use Christopher Rufo as an example was not to target him. I actually cited him quite a bit in my critical race theory article that I wrote back in 2020, so I mean, it's not to say that he may be the nicest guy ever. I've never met him. I don't have any personal relationship with him. That is not the point. The point is that he has openly, and he's writing a book saying we should embrace the tactics of the cultural Marxists. And that is very, very different. Previously, you saw them using these kinds of tactics, but they did it in underhanded way. They were being duplicitous. They were doing it under the guise of being quote unquote conservative or libertarian, freedom minded, whatever the label which is usually just a banner for targeting audiences with marketing. Unfortunately, these days, not to say they don't have ideological or philosophical roots, but that's what they've deteriorated to, it looks like. So I think this has been going on for a very long time. The difference is you're seeing them openly say we have to embrace these tactics to win. And my concern is, what does winning look like? And this is what I talked about in my article. I'm like, what is the cost? Do the ends justify the means? And if that might be short-term operational success, you may have that short-term operational success, but at the stake of what? Risking the Constitution, risking, subversion of the Constitution, risking a color revolution. I mean, these are very, very important things to consider. When you have to weigh the pros and cons, and is it worth it for operational success?
Well, I've noticed that too. Even if you study history, if you study the Soviet Union or even the fascists, this is kind of, it feels similar to that. What's happening here? This weird cultural dialectic, this pendulum swing, and both sides are feeding off of each other for their own existence and for their purpose. And so to see the right, who once claimed and still does, I think there's a lot of people like myself that are on the right that would claim this, and I think I do my best at least to hold to this, to be principled conservatives, where we're going to hold our principles even if it means losing, even if it means we're not going to get the results we want right away, even if it means losing friends or losing some political sway or influence in whatever particular thing it is. But to see these same people now shift to this almost like Machiavellianism, which now they're outright saying that's what they are, which is just wild to me. Wild to me that they're saying this. And what's even more wild is they're saying this out loud, and so many so-called conservatives, and especially Christians, which worries me even more, are just embracing this. Like, I don't understand that. I truly don't understand that. I don't know if you can give any thoughts to that. But I
think there's been so much, infiltration. So there's been infiltration through, this is Gramsci, the long march through the institutions.
Right.
And the fact that we're coming full circle where they've really embraced it. He actually didn't coin the term, but that it was, was it Rudy Duchke? I can't pronounce it, but who?
None of these names I know how to pronounce. I just see them and
terrible with that. But he actually didn't coin the term. But he, it was the idea that he conveyed is that and Mao Zedong adopted this as well. Of course, this idea that you have to infiltrate through the institutions, and of course, these institutions are what? It's the 5 pillars of society. This is law, medicine, education, the churches, and the culture, right? Mm-hmm. Media, culture, entertainment, whatever. Take your pick of that umbrella. But yeah, so that's really, and I think what we're seeing is the full circle of that, because they've been so successful. And this is really, most people aren't talking about this, but this is Fabian tactics, right? The gradual, steady kind of infiltration, incrementalism. So the Fabian socialists were, their mascot was originally the wolf in sheep's clothing. That became their coat of arms, and their mascot became the tortoise. And this was to model after their incrementalism. Now, I haven't found any evidence to corroborate this, but I suspect the wolf in sheep's clothing was a nod to the Hegelian dialectic tactic they used. I haven't found that spelled out anywhere, but that seems to be from everything I've read about.
Kind of putting dots together. Yeah.
Yes, that's what it looks like. So but that's really what it is. I think because they've been so effective in infiltrating all of the, religious institutions, like definitely, a lot of the big churches, a lot of the, that certainly Christianity, the various sects, but really not just Christianity, all religions. They've been so effective. And I think this is very intentional to create this syncretization of religion so that we can march towards this, one world kind of theosophical soup. Yep. And they have to start deteriorating and obliterating eventually all the boundaries in order to do so.
Especially within the church, I've noticed this. You see like Big Eva, for example, the Gospel Coalition, Christianity Today, Russell Moore, the ERLC, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That book Megan Basham wrote, I don't know if you read that. Shepherds for Sale. There's some things in there that I'm not particularly in agreement with, but I think the general premise is largely true. It's demonstrating how so many evangelical institutions that millions of Christians around the West, particularly in America, trust and embrace for their doctrine and for instruction and all this stuff, which is ridiculous. We should be turning to Scripture alone for those things, which is kind of the hallmark of the Protestant Reformation that we've just thrown out the window for the sake of these institutions. And they've pushed the Overton window of the church to the left. And they've pushed critical race theory on us, and they've pushed even queer theory and all this weird stuff, all under the name of being compassionate and loving to our neighbor. Yes. And now you're seeing these same Christians who were once over here embracing like Eric Kahn or Joel Webbin or all of these so-called Christian nationalists who were once part of these institutions, Acts 29, the Southern Baptist Convention, and now they've moved the pendulum all the way over here to this Christo-fascist nonsense, this woke right nonsense, and really it just reveals kind of what you're saying, that the institutions have done such a good job, essentially brainwashing them into thinking in these terms alone, to where they don't even realize they're doing the same thing that they were just criticizing on the left, and it's just they're just repeating it over and over again. It's crazy. It drives me insane watching it.
I feel you. And it drives me insane watching this, festering of people. I really don't want to be derogatory, but it feels just like NPCs who are just getting caught up, and the centrifugal force is just churning the dialectic. They're just round and round they go off, and it's almost like lightning speed towards the omega point. I'm like, what are you guys doing? Stop, just step out.
Right.
That's really frustrating to watch. And I think it's because they have done such a good job of brainwashing, infiltrating, and, blurring, disintegrating these boundaries. So people don't have any anchor. Like you said, they shouldn't be looking to, some book. They should be if they're Christians and they're looking for their, the term would be like a plumb line. They're looking for their anchor, the thing to keep them morally straight, right? If they're looking for that, why wouldn't they go to their scripture? Why wouldn't they go to the Bible?
There's a famous passage in Galatians that talks about this very concept. And this is a big point of disagreement, of course, with like Eastern Orthodox or Catholics and Protestants, the idea of authority and what's our authority and what do we appeal to for doctrine and for every faith and practice, as it's called. The Protestant, the whole idea of the Protestant Reformation is Scripture alone, sola scriptura. This is this is like the bedrock of the whole thing. And so the irony, of course, is we're seeing a lot of these Protestants, Reformed Protestants. They scream sola scriptura from the mountaintops, but in practice, they're doing the same thing. They're turning to their earthly authority. They're turning to Tim Keller. They're turning to John Piper. And I'm not singling these people out as if they're everything these people say are bad. I'm just saying they're not Scripture. And so like there's this passage in Galatians that says, or Paul's writing, he's an apostle writing from the authority of the Holy Spirit in inspired Scripture. He says this, where he says, if I or even an angel from heaven preach a gospel contrary to what I've delivered, let him be accursed. And I use the word anathema. In other words, like damned to hell. And then he repeats that phrase again. So that right there saying, even the apostles themselves aren't the authority. It's the written word that's the authority. And so if we're throwing that out the window and getting our philosophy from people who might not always be correct, obviously no one's always correct, who even worse, as we're seeing now with Big Eva, is, and this applies, of course, to many other things other than Big Eva, but just for this example, where they're pushing this sort of worldly, Marxist, cultural Marxist framework onto the church. Well, now we're going to start reading the Bible through that framework, and not actually just for what it says, and not actually for its original context and meaning, which is exactly what you're saying, which is why you'll see a lot of these Christian nationalist woke right people invoking Scripture And it just shows they don't actually have any idea what they're talking about. It falls on their face. They're just reading into it what J.D. Greer or Tim Keller told them to believe, and they don't even realize it. And as they're going against these guys, it's crazy.
It is crazy. I think I've written 3 articles on this now, and that's the thing I keep reiterating over and over again is a lot of these people, although they may parrot, some of the philosophers that they subscribe to, but most of them are not real academics. Like, they haven't read this material with any kind of intensity or rigor. They're really just using the tactics. And I think that's even more concerning. It's because they don't understand the roots of what it is that they're implementing. So I think that's very, very dangerous. And it doesn't really matter whether it comes from left or right. You're now just serving the end goal of the teleological ends of the subversion. If you mirror them, right, for the operational success. So whether it's the woke left or this, fascistic, these people who are vying for theocracy, it's literally fundamentally, like, diametrically in antithesis to everything this country was founded upon, and Christianity itself. Everything in the scripture talks about how you have free will, right? There is nothing in, and I'm no expert. I am certainly not, somebody to come to for any kind of theological guidance, but from my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, there is nothing that says you should go and force your beliefs on another person.
You see the opposite. Read the book of Acts. You see this. I wrote an article about this exact thing, about forced religion, forced even church attendance, which I see some of these people advocating for now, using literally at gunpoint, forcing people, like frog marching people into the pews, which is it's insane. It's not only un-American, it's wildly unchristian. If you read through the book of Acts, their mode of operation to spread the gospel and further their message and actually change culture, which eventually changes government and politics, because that's just downstream from culture, and culture is downstream from religion. And it was just, we're going to persuade with love and truth. We're not going to force. We're not going to punish people who don't believe what we believe. We're not going to frog march people into churches. We're not going to try to appeal to Caesar to force people to adopt our religious orthodoxy. We're going to persuade. We're going to love people. We're going to serve people to the point of death, to the point of self-sacrifice, which is exactly what Jesus did. That is diametrically opposed to all of these woke games, no matter which way you spin it. And it just shows that they're not really Christians, like, at least in how they act, at least in the philosophies that they're adopting. It's not Christian at all.
And most of these and most of these philosophers that they're bowing down to are inherently Gnostic. And I know people push back a lot, because Gnosticism was a very specific, group. That was a sect of, that were considered to be Christian heretics in the first century. I think it's first to third. There seems to be a span. And they're still, Gnostics present today. But I use little g Gnosticism as kind of an umbrella term. It really is just this. It's the same shared sentiment of this kind of notion of, being trapped by a demiurge, whether they believe in a literal demiurge or not. But, this notion that somehow, this ignorant God has created the earth and limited man's capacity by withholding gnosis, that's where that term Gnosticism comes from. This, gnosis in Greek is the knowledge. And, so they believe that if, Lucifer is the light bearer, could, empower them and liberate them with the gnosis, then, they themselves can become God. And you see some iteration of this in all of these ancient mystery religions, in a lot of these philosophers, who are railing against the very notion of existence itself, like, Heidegger, who a lot of the woke right people pay homage to. He talks about the concept of throneness, which is similar to Marxist flungness, right? I think it's Gewentefight. I'm not even going to try the German, sorry. But Gewentefelt, I butchered. But you can go look it up, of the German term. But it's essentially this notion that, we didn't ask to be here, and then we were thrown into the world. Sartre has a very similar concept. Man is thrown into the world, and having been thrown into the world, he's thus responsible for everything he does. And it's this grievance kind of a mentality that we didn't ask for our circumstances, and we've been
we're oppressed.
We're oppressed
resentment
by it.
Motivated. Yeah.
And you see this kind of theme constantly, instead of, and then we can overcome it by becoming, right? The whole notion of becoming is this idea of becoming God, essentially. That's the man becoming God. It's self-apotheosis and self-divinization. And I see this just as a recurring theme through all. That's why I use the little g Gnosticism. And I know I've gotten some criticism for, that's not technically Gnosticism. And Hermeticism and Gnosticism were arguing against each other. To me, it's kind of like anthroposophy. I can never pronounce it. But Rudolf Steiner broke off from Madame Blavatsky's Theosophy. Anthropocene? Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. I can never say it. But, he created his own, but it's still the same occult, esoteric, roots. And they have mostly their was shared. So they have nuanced differences, but oftentimes when these groups split, it's much more about, a battle for power, ego battles.
It's not that the underlying presuppositions are really that different. They're underlying ideas are the same. Yeah.
They shared telos, shared ontology, shared metaphysics. It's just the, nuanced difference. The presuppositions are ultimately
even more modern people like Saul Alinsky, which we mentioned at the beginning of this, which, Rufo is one of the guys that said we should adopt these Alinsky tactics. This is a guy, and I truly believe this. You cannot separate, which is why I would, never mind. I was going to say something about the Crusades. I won't get into that, but you can't separate what someone believes from what they're doing. I don't believe you can do that, but they want to do that. They think they can play that game and get away with it. And so, for example, Saul Alinsky, he is famous for dedicating his work to Lucifer directly.
The first radical who was granted his own kingdom. Yeah.
Yep. You can't separate that from what he's actually trying to accomplish in his tactics. Like they're linked.
Exactly. And I think this is another huge problem because, and this is largely because they've been so successful in infiltrating the education system, is so people don't have a sense of, critical processes in order, and I'm not talking about critical theory, but, critical thinking processes to discover and to, find truth and, realism. They don't have that foundation anymore. That's been completely eroded, and in many cases inverted. And so what they end up doing is there's this deference to authority, and they take a lot of these texts at face value. Mm-hmm. And so I just put up, I'm going to be, hopefully next month I'll finish it, but I'm in the middle of working on a book, and I put up a large chunk of it as a preview on my Substack. If anybody's interested, wants to chat about it, but it's Hegel's Dialectic, a Gnostic Jacob's Ladder, and a Machinery of Control. And my main thesis is that it is exactly this, is that it was written in Aesopian language as a blueprint, signal to the initiates for a blueprint. Right. And but people take it as face value for those who are not initiated and don't understand how to interpret the esoteric messaging. They take the exoteric veneer on its face. And that's exactly, when you look at Theosophists, this is exactly what Madame Blavatsky and Alice Bailey repeatedly said. This will only be useful to those who understand the esoteric messaging. That is why there's a whole initiation process through the arcane school. They're not hiding this. They're letting you know that the exoteric veneer is not the primary message, that they are trying to convey an esoteric message to their initiates. Yep. And I think that's a huge part of the problem, because they take just the text as being literal.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think one thing I've seen too from the Christian nationalist side of the woke right, the sect of it, is there's been this kind of this ongoing assault against the idea of presuppositional apologetics, which underneath that is kind of this idea where everybody walks in to any given situation, any set of belief, any mode of tactic with a set of presupposed beliefs about like a lens. In other words, that's the whole concept of a worldview. And it's like they want to attack that because I think they, in a way, want to get away with what you're saying, where they want to just read it literally so then they can justify using the tactics, not understanding that the tactics have presupposed ideas behind them that are evil. And
I mean, I think of Gnosticism as literally subversion. It's using so you're using one facade in order to subvert it's really Aufheben. To me, that is what Gnosticism is. And I don't mean to, I'm just going to, I feel like I always have to qualify everything. It doesn't mean he's an inherently evil person. I've met some. They're very sweet, wonderful. They may be great people. I personally believe they're deceived. That's not for me to judge, that's out of my hands. But, I think it's because you're using a facade of one thing to subvert it and invert it. And it is so to me, that's really what it is. And it is Aufheben, because Aufheben is this term, of course, that was Hegel's use of the word, was a very oxymoronic, English is a very, in some ways, simple language. We don't have these kind of complex kind of terms that have they're almost like umbrella casings in many other languages, but it means simultaneously to lift up and preserve while simultaneously canceling and tearing down. But you still have this kind of essence that's preserved, and this is how the spiral progresses, right?
Yeah. So simplifying it here a little bit for people. No, you're good. This is great. Just like for people watching, what are some common tactics used that people can see in culture, so that what are some things that people can observe, some things that you could point people to watch out for in culture, whether it's stuff that Tucker Carlson is doing or Candace Owens or Jake Shields or any of these people, anyone in the Christian nationalist movement, they're all kind of doing the same thing. What are some real life on the ground tactics, and how can we recognize them when we see them? If that makes sense. I don't know if that question makes sense.
Yes. So, I mean, very similarly, you had brought up, the BLM movement and a few years ago. So now we're kind of seeing another kind of racial target coming out of a lot of these, whether it's the woke right or I'm seeing it from many different groups. It's really not just
the Shiloh Hendricks thing, the Carmela, or whatever his name is, Anthony thing. That's a good example. Yeah.
So we're now seeing there's this kind of inversion where they're promoting, very similar to like a neo-Nazi type of rhetoric, this, white nationalist type of messaging, and they're condemning, a lot of them are targeting Jews as a group, but this is, it's not about the Jews. It's an easy target, right? They're a very, very small percentage of the population. It's kind of ludicrous when you
they're like 2% of the population or something. It's something ridiculously small.
0.3% actually of the world population.
Oh yeah. I think it's like 2. Is it like 2%? I saw that number. Is that the United States?
That might be United States. A larger percentage, because at one point they were, more safe here. Yeah. That's quite true now. But this is where it's like, you don't have to be a Christian to recognize the value of the 10 Commandments, love thy neighbor as thyself, right? If you really did that, you would not be behaving this way towards Jews, towards blacks, or any race. I mean, you just wouldn't, right? Because it's kind of antithetical to what the 10 Commandments say. But they're picking, but again, this boils down to, it's not just, so it becomes subjectivism, it's postmodernism, right? You're just recreating narratives and there's no real truth. So this, paltering where you weaponize truths is a very, common tactic amongst all these groups. But it's also, again, this grievance mentality, right? That is, now we're the oppressed groups. The whites, the Christians are the oppressed groups. And so we must retaliate. We're now we're victimized. And so then they pick whoever their oppressor is, and I keep saying the only game anybody ever seemed to learn to play growing up was pin the tail on the donkey, because it's like, really, we're going to pick the 0.3% of the world population, and they're responsible for every one of my grievances and every evil in the world ever. Okay, well, if life were quite that simple.
Well, Israel is only 0.3% of the world population, but they're somehow so powerful to control the most, illustrious, powerful political entity that's ever existed, the United States. That's something that you'll see. I saw Tucker Carlson playing this game on a recent podcast. On one hand, he says that Israel would be dead without us. They need us. They're dependent on us. They're weak. They wouldn't exist without us. And then on the other hand, they're so powerful that they basically control every institution in the United States. Like, which is it? You can't. But why do they say that? It's I think part of this whole grievance idea. It doesn't need to be consistent. It just needs to agitate people. And
exactly.
Yeah.
That's why I say postmodernism, right? Because it's subjective truth. It's based on your position. So there's not a truth outside of your perspective.
Yep.
So, yeah, I mean, I think those are definitely some tactics, this kind of grievance mentality, blaming everybody outside of yourself. That seems to be a very common theme. I really would like people to really think about long-term consequences. So the cancel culture, I'm not a fan of it on any side. I really subscribe to. I've recently read that it was misattributed to Voltaire. He didn't even say it, but I don't care. I mean, it's very famously known as Voltaire's saying that, I may not like what you have to say, but I defend your right to say it. Right. And this is the entire premise of the First Amendment, and it is so incredibly integral to our ability to think and our ability to function as a society, and of course to everything the American founding stands upon. So I think that this idea of canceling on any side, when it's expedient to you, you think about the short-term operational success. But what happens when another administration is in office and they want to cancel you? I'm not happy with it. And I'll just say one thing that I know is not going to be popular, but I'll just throw it out there. I'm not happy with this pathologizing of the, online behavior. Nobody's thinking about the ramifications of this, except probably the very people we do not want thinking about the ramifications of it.
Right.
You have to stop thinking. You have to have principles. You either have principles or you just care about operational success. It's one or the other.
Exactly.
You can't have.
Yep. That was one of the things that I talked about with Carrie. For those that, I haven't uploaded that episode yet, obviously, but I guess upon watching this one, that one will be up. So that's one of the things we talked about, was just the idea of principles existing outside of the, the results of holding them. So like principles only exist, or all the principles are only principles if they remain constant, even when you're losing. And so if you throw them out the window at the expense of a loss, or you throw them out the window to win, they're not principle. You don't actually have principles. You have to choose one or the other at the end of the day.
You have strategy. Right.
Yeah.
There's a huge difference between principles and strategy. And so that's really where I'm at. I'm like, people need to be thinking about this. If you look through the history of psychology, we're now on DSM-5. It looks almost unrecognizable from DSM-1. And they did not change each of those, diagnoses, like the diagnosis. They didn't change each of them. I'm not saying there were no psychologists who didn't have good intentions. Of course there are. There are a lot of people in that field who are in it because they want to help people. But oftentimes what happened, they changed those diagnoses because they had legal ramifications. This was political. This becomes about policy. This is expedience. This is not about helping people. Changing the diagnosis didn't make somebody now healthier and more mentally resilient. It made it now change the course of how you deal with somebody who, in terms of legal, in terms of group settings, in organization, that's what it impacts. And I'm very concerned because we live in an age where technology is rapidly advancing, and we have a lot of people who are very incentivized to put us in digital gulags. And when you start putting these diagnoses and classifying them as pathologies and clinical pathologies, not just, speculating about or having discussions about it. When you start to put classifications on these things, you're now giving tools for people who don't have principles and have operational success.
It becomes a weapon at the end of the day. Yeah.
Weapon. Exactly
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
I feel like nobody's thinking about this, and
No.
I'm very good about it.
I was actually, that's interesting you say all this, because so my dad is he's a school, so he's a school teacher, and then he's also their on staff counselor. He has a degree in biblical counseling, and he talks about this all the time. I was talking about this the other day, of how this secular model of psychology is just being used to, especially against children. It's being weaponized, which is getting way off topic probably, but it's being weaponized against children, and even now, kind of what we're seeing in the political sphere, it's being weaponized against people. I mean, look at that would actually
be terrorist.
Yeah. It's
or domestic extremist, whatever they're calling it these days.
Yeah, it's. I just don't think people are really. You're right. I don't think people are really thinking through the ramifications of this kind of thing.
So short term. They're so short sighted, and it's because they don't have core principles. So I had this argument with somebody because I had written an article about Immanuel Kant. I know this is a little off topic, but it's related. But how he gave rise to the libertarian movement. And this is not to slam libertarians. I know many of them, and I'm actually aligned with a lot of the principles. That's not the point. But it is because, they ultimately, I think that they were upset with this because they didn't want libertarians to be perceived as being amoral. And, or people who didn't have a religious, background to be, or to subscribe to a particular religion, to be seen as amoral. And, I said that my dad always used to say, my dad was, he actually was an atheist, and he happened to be one of the most moral people I know, that I've ever known. And he would always say that most people need religion to have a moral compass. He said that, you don't need religion to have a moral compass, but most people do. Most people don't have a moral compass without it. And I actually think that's true. So that doesn't mean that there aren't people who are not religious, who aren't, good, decent, moral people. Of course there are. But most people, they need that anchor, right? They need the core underlying principles, something to subscribe to. And in the case of religion, that would be the scripture, that would be the Bible that gives them, and they need that worldview. They need that's the foundation. That's the metaphysics that gives them the reason to have any kind of a moral compass. But I agree with your dad about what he was saying about psychology. And if I can get myself some time, I'm going to finish this article. But the title of it is actually Esoteric, Constructivist, and Self-Apotheosis Theme in the History and Trajectory of Psychology, Philosophical and Mystery Religion Connections. And that is kind of my, again, I know not a popular thesis, but that is my thesis, that I think that, and I've studied enough of it, that, again, not to say that nobody in the field has helped people. It's of course not true. My mom's a psychologist. My sister's actually a counselor. People do go into it wanting to help people, but the roots, the foundation of it are esoteric. I mean, that's undeniable. So
yeah, I'm with you there. I'm definitely with you there. Well, this has been good. We'll have to do this again sometime and dig into the weeds and some more stuff here. I will link all your social media and your Substack and all that in the description for people to check out. Highly recommend doing so. You post a lot of good stuff. Any closing thoughts, closing remarks? I don't know.
Yeah, I guess the only things I would just really, I think I tweeted yesterday that I wish people spent as much time, and I'll correct it. I would say like even a fraction of the time engaging with ideas themselves, discovering what are their core values, their core principles, whether that is biblical or otherwise, as they do in getting caught up in this cult of personalities and I wish people would do that, because if they did, cult of personality shouldn't really, the people matter when it's your community, when it's your family, your personal relationships, of course, then the people matter. But when you're dealing, especially with removed, whether it's online or whether it's theater, film, and entertainment sphere, you're dealing with figures, their personalities. You don't know these people, and people get so caught up in it, and you don't know who they are. I wish people would but because they don't want to do the rigorous intellectual work to decide, what the ideas themselves are and where do they truly align, and where are they truly opposed, they end up just kind of like being shuffled back and forth with whatever group.
And it's easy to that's the easy path. It's easy to outsource your thinking to somebody else and just blindly trust them, which again goes back to that idea of sola scriptura. That's hard work. You have to dig into it yourself and think through these concepts and think through the passages and study them and understand the context. Nobody wants to do that. They would rather just turn on Joel Webbin and have him tell you what to believe, which is utterly foolish. These people will drive you into hell at the end of the day.
I don't know these people, but just kind of like removed. I'm not talking about those individuals specifically, but anybody have the best of intentions. You don't know, but the road to hell was paved with good intentions, right? You have to do work yourself and decide where you stand.
I mean, I've said this on Twitter numerous times, but even like stuff I post, especially if I'm talking about scripture, don't just take my word for it. Like, dig into this yourself. And because I think that's the antidote. We talk about solutions. I think that's the antidote to this stuff, is getting people to think in that way and getting people to actually let go of these tribalistic tendencies that want to outsource thinking to other people and start doing the work yourself, start doing the reading yourself. Understand that, yes, other people's work and thoughts, of course, are helpful, which is, I wouldn't believe that if that's kind of what we're doing here. But the point of something like this is to point people to that understanding and to that practice.
That's right.
So anyways, this has been good. Yeah. Thanks for joining. So
thanks so much.